Good morning guys, Mac here. Hope you're all having a great day. I am. I started out my day, which is why I'm a bit red in the face, going out for a run. Managed to slip and fall over along the canal out here. Didn't fall in the canal. Anyone who knows me will know that I would put that down as a win. I wasn't quite sure what to title the vlog today because I started out with the idea of talking about how there seems to be a shift back to looking for IT generalists when it comes to IT resourcing. So people that know a lot of stuff about many different subjects rather than specialising with deep knowledge on particular areas. And while that's interesting in its own right, the more I went through it, the more I realised what my ideas were actually about were focusing on why I like working in unified comms so much rather than, going off and doing some of those other things that I've specialised in over the years, things like Exchange and all that sort of good stuff. So I thought it might be an interesting thing to talk about for a little while. Several of my friends, for example, they tend to work more in the technology consumer sector rather than the systems integrator or provider. So just to be clear, I'm talking about people like banks and insurers, people that leverage and use technology. So a lot of my friends tend to work in those teams that look after and deliver those areas, whereas I've always specialised in the SI area. And the reason being is it gets me lots more varied projects because I'm moving around from client to client all the time, working on similar technologies, and you get exposed to very different areas. Now, it's interesting hearing what they think unified comms is. Just a quick point on that term, UC. I think unified comms as a term for what the industry is in that area might be a little bit out of date now. I'm not sure it is particularly valid, but perhaps that's a point for another vlog. Anyway, they seem to think that UC is really phones and perhaps a bit of instant messaging, whereas of course it is actually a lot more than that. I'm not that interested in phones. I'm as interested in phones as perhaps a developer might be interested in keyboards. It's a tool and part of the tool set that we use as part of our industry, but it's not something that's particularly that interesting to me. And in fact, apart from deploying them, I can't really remember the last time I used a desk phone because that's not how I work anymore. So it's just part of that technology stack. If you look at the marketing for UC, it's always been pretty interesting, I think. I mean, some of the terms you used to hear bandied around, perhaps not so much anymore, were things like make work something you do rather than somewhere you go. I quite like that one. Was that a Microsoft one, I think? Can't quite remember. The other one you used to hear, again, it might have been a Microsoft one, was be there without being there. I don't know, I find terms like that a little bit twee. I can kind of understand the point, but they are very, very much marketing terms, and I'm not quite convinced that they explain what UC is about. So for me, the outcome of why UC is so interesting, i.e. what it actually delivers, is not only something I leverage every day to work because I'm rarely in any particular office, I work from wherever I am, which is so enabling, but it's also about what it delivers for users because it's one of the few technologies that I have been involved in deploying to people and they are genuinely pleased and excited about what they're getting from it. I can't remember, for example, the last version, last Exchange upgrade I ever did, and an end user seeing other than disruption as to why it was happening. They didn't see any point to it. They weren't particularly excited about the outcome. You roll out a good UC platform to people, and they love it, and they thank you for it. And you can go around offices after you've deployed this stuff, and people will be generally engaging to talk to you about it because it changes how they work. And that's one of the softer pieces that I like about this technology. It's kind of, it gets you engaged with people a little bit more and in terms of delivery from the SI channel. And I just find it a bit more interesting than working just on the back end stuff that fixes IT problems but perhaps doesn't deliver that much new stuff to the users. So if I had to summarise why I like this area so much, it really comes down to two things. Firstly, like I just said, it's the effect it has on the user base and how enabling they find it. And the other one is how technically challenging it can be to deliver. It kind of involves so many different layers, regardless of which vendor you look at, but there's so many different layers to it, and there's so much complexity in places that if you don't get this stuff right, it becomes really hard for people to leverage and use it. Now, with products in this space, one of the things I find quite interesting is if you get it 85-90% correct, it's that last 10% that ruins the user experience because they'll get the scenario where it doesn't quite work from one building, or it works on Wi-Fi and doesn't work on wired, or the other way around. And it's always those little pieces that frustrate your users. So you require a certain level of accuracy and eye for detail when you deploy this stuff. In the tech world, if you look at how you get people that work in tech, I've generally come across two types of techies. There are the techies that like to deploy stuff to the point that it works and then they're happy. And then there are techies that like to deploy stuff to the point that it works, but they also want it deployed properly, as in how it's supposed to work. And I think those people with that latter view, i.e. they not only want something to work as it's supposed to, so it looks like it's working, but also so it works in the way that it's designed to work. I think it's that latter type of deployment that becomes really important in the UC world, because you can often, for example, kind of get stuff working out the box and you kind of think it's working, and if you leave it like that, you'll quickly become exposed because users will find all the bits that don't quite work how it's expected. So it's that eye for accuracy and the multiple layers of technology that are involved here that I find particularly compelling, and it makes me always seem to get attracted to this area. So to give you an idea from a technology perspective, let's take a Microsoft-centric view of it. If you look at how the Microsoft stack builds, if you're deploying a UC stack, let's say it's based on today's on-premises type stuff, because I know it's evolving with things like Teams, but let's stay with the on-premises stuff for now. The kind of things you need to have a good knowledge of include things like Active Directory. Well, why do you need to know that? Well, you've got all the numbering information that comes from AD, there's a lot of technology components that are held within that directory. So often you'll find yourself doing a lot of work to rectify people's Active Directory states, for example. So you can often get drawn into that. So having a good knowledge of working on AD it's a big part of UC. So you end up knowing, or kind of having to know a fair bit about that. Above that, there's things like all the database estates around SQL, for example. So Skype, for example, has a quite a big dependency on SQL for several components. So you get drawn into that piece as a technology. Things like, how you spec and put together SQL servers for things like high availability and workloads and capacity planning and all that sort of stuff. So you've already gone from working in UC to actually getting a good grounding in how SQL works. I mean, I can remember days having to spend time trying to reverse engineer some code that were in some SQL databases because they wanted some slightly different behavior. Wow, that was a project and a half, but probably not for this vlog anyway. But you see my point, you get dragged into other technology areas. What about things like storage? Well, storage doesn't sound that important, but it absolutely is, certainly to sort of larger scale deployments, because there are considerations around storage capacity, storage performance, how that storage is actually provisioned, for example. So again, you start to get a good basis in these technologies. What else? Another one that's certainly become a lot more prevalent over the last, say, 5 or 6 years is virtualization. If you're looking to roll out real-time technology onto virtualized platforms, well, you can absolutely do it, and pretty much most of the vendors support it now as far as I know. But there are unique dependencies on rolling out real-time stuff. You end up having to have a really good basis in how the virtualization platforms work, whether that's Hyper-V or VMware. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you become an SME in that, but you certainly know your way around how VMware or Hyper-V works, because you need it to support your platform. And if you get that piece wrong, your platform's not going to work. Well, not going to work properly anyway. The next step above that, or below that, depending on which direction you're coming from, of course, is networking. Well, again, if you're delivering real-time comms, you need to understand how the network works. You need to understand how things like quality of service works. You need to understand how things like bandwidth aggregation services work and bandwidth optimization. Bandwidth optimization could be interesting because the amount of times I've gone into larger sites who say they don't use it, and then you look at stuff and think, yeah, you absolutely do, because you can see it happening. Well, having a good understanding of how those sort of technologies are achieved can really help you make sure this stuff works properly. So again, you can see that you're being pushed into technology areas that are slightly off your core delivery, and it's that sort of stuff that I find really quite compelling. Even further things on the networking, you have to know your way around how firewalls work, and what about things like network load balancing. So you get drawn into all these technology areas, and for me, that really feeds my need to work on technology. At a higher level, you can also run into things like you need to leverage a fair bit of scripting. Now that's always been true. I mean, I've always found it interesting. We've interviewed people over the years that claim to have been managing 10,000 seat plus systems, and yet claim not to know PowerShell or even back in the day things like VB script. Now that they've either been doing things massively the hard way and manually, or some other people have been doing that work. I always find that bit quite interesting. Understanding how PowerShell works and how scripting works, it saves a ton of work, and also in modern day systems today, you have to have a knowledge of that stuff to be able to deploy it properly. There are so many areas. This whole thing stacks up. It also leads you into integration to other vendors. So even if you're Microsoft focused in the UC stack, for example, you will end up working with Mitels and your Ciscos and your Avayas of this world to get those integrations between those platforms. And again, I suppose that kind of leans towards networking because, you know, I guarantee you'll end up looking at, I don't know, maybe Cisco ISR routers and the voice configurations on those to try and get them working together. And eventually you will pick up how they work and how they operate. And it's that sort of stuff, the multi-vendor exposure as well, which is quite compelling. So that stuff around UC being such a varied area to work in, and the fact that it delivers something really solid for the users that the users love to get. And it's a compelling package, all of it. It fulfills my need to be exposed to new technologies and to get to learn stuff all the time, but also delivers something that people want. You can't really ask for more than that in IT, can you? So this brings me on to what I was talking about originally around, I was looking recently at some job specs that have been out there, and there does seem to be a massive shift towards a more IT generalist role rather than, you know, kind of particular technology roles and, you know, lining people up to technologies that they're good at. One thing I do find interesting about those adverts is they're effectively asking for SMEs in about 10 different areas, and they're often not even related areas, and I find that quite interesting. Let's take that list that I just quickly ran through. What was it? Active Directory, SQL, storage, virtualization, networking, and, you know, kind of integration, say, to Mitel. If somebody claimed to be an SME on all of those items, I wouldn't believe them about any of them. I don't think people would have the capacity to do that. Now, I'd be willing to be proved wrong, but I don't think you can be an expert on all of those things. I think you can have a lead SME experience, which then can be backed up on, you know, good knowledge and all those things that lead into that technology. But the idea of being an SME on, you know, 10, 12 different technology stacks, that doesn't stand up for me. Which, of course, leads me back to why I think UC is such a good area to work in. Well, this is dragging on a bit now, and I only wanted a quick chat while I was waiting for somebody to turn up. But I'd love to hear people's thoughts on such things like this. It's a changing time for the unified comms market. You know, there's a big shift towards, I'm going to say cloud. I thought I'd avoided it for most of this. There are a shift to kind of service-based delivery now rather than, you know, sort of on-premises stuff. And the Microsoft stack is evolving very quickly into the Teams online world. So I suspect the next few years is going to be very disruptive. At this point, I don't think those core skills to deliver this kind of stuff have changed that much. So I still think it's a particularly challenging but also a really rewarding area to work in. Like I say, would love to hear your thoughts. I'm going to sign off now because, well, yeah, I've been talking for ages. I'll catch you guys later.